four themes that I want to talk about, particularly the politicization of education, first of all, because we are living in a world in which education has become highly politicized. You will feel the impact of OECD, the European Union, and many other international bodies. And the second thing, how does that impact on the new world of childhood? Children are growing up in a very different world today. And with that in mind, I want to go back to some first principles of learning. What do we know about learning of children, of teachers, of school principals? And finally, I want to talk about what my colleague, erstwhile colleague at Cambridge, David Hargreaves, talked about in England. Leading schools you need to fly below the radar. Trends shaping education. We have clearly a totally new economic landscape. Service industries are knowledge intensive. There are widening divides between affluence and poverty. That gap is not closing in most countries. We have new transformative technologies in which the users are creating the knowledge. Just think of YouTube and LinkedIn and all these things where young people spend their time, and I assume Austrian young people are no different from young people everywhere else in the world, where they spend time, maybe 4, 5, 6 hours a day on the internet, creating new content in a world in which knowledge is becoming more lateral and more shared. And the changing social connections and the values that go with this, different notion of home life. We talk about parents, but how many children now do not have two parents, or possibly don't even have one parent? And the whole nature in different countries around the world is changing the nature of home life. How have the demand for skills changed? This from Levy and Murnane talk about, I don't know if that you can see that graph very clearly, but it is saying that the kind of routine manual work that we were talking earlier, the minister was talking about vocational education. How is vocational education changing to accommodate the fact that routine manual work, that's the very bottom line, is simply disappearing, and that even routine cognitive work is going down, and the real, where the world is changing economically, is the non-routine interactive work. That the jobs in the future, which of course haven't been invented yet, are non-routine, interpersonal, and cognitive. So we have to think all the time about the school curriculum and the lives of young people and what it means to live in a world where these things are changing. From my friend Michael, the Zollen and the Vollen, which is a kind of main theme I want to look at, the cartoon at the top right very much actually depicts what's happening in a lot of countries which children are being put through that machine, which is about attainment, comparative attainment between schools and between countries. And the Vollen is very much, I think, echoing the kind of things the minister was saying earlier on this afternoon. The Vollen, it matters how you see yourself. And the positive image, because she talked about identity, Identität, is how do you see yourself? My pussycat sees itself as a lion as well, unfortunately. This is our Archbishop, or somebody's Archbishop. Your Archbishop, I think, Louise. We don't have one in Scotland. But the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his Christmas sermon, he says this. We shall do our best to turn you into active little consumers and performers. We shall test you relentlessly in school from the word go. We shall do everything we can to make childhood a brief and rather regrettable stage on the way to the real thing, turning you into a useful cog in the social machine. And then he quotes two pieces of research. The Society Good Childhood Report, which is actually quite depressing about the nature of childhood, and likewise the Cambridge Review of Primary Education, which was also a fairly damning report about what he talks about crushing and narrowing children's experience. Are we crushing and narrowing children's experience? Now, I'm talking, because that's my brief, to talk about international experience, and you constantly have to say, is that true here? Is that true in Austria? If it's true in England, true in the United States, true in many other countries of the world, is it true here? Are we actually doing this, or is Austria so far exempt? I was trying to find out what the translation was for value added, because value added is now a very technical notion which looks at attainment before you come into school and attainment when you leave school. And so what does the school add in terms of value? And these were the words I came across. Mehrwert, Zusatz, Nutzung, Wertschöpfung, etc. And the question that it raises for me about value added is the word Wert, or in English, worth. And Herbert Spencer wrote a tract a long, long time ago in which he said, what knowledge is of most worth? When we talk about value added, are we talking about values, or are we talking about something that's more a technical process? I was in Hong Kong, part of a team, an inspection team, if you like, or a quality assurance team, and we were visiting a school. I was evaluating what was happening, and the inspectors said, this is a wonderful school, these young people, these young women are so responsible, that there's a wonderful atmosphere in the school, these children love their school, they are learning well, and the head teacher was smiling happily. And then they said, but one thing, your value added is low. And she said, what? Say that again. Your value added is low. She said, how could that be? What we've been talking about for the last hour and a half is about values, about these young people and the values that they're gaining in this school. And you're telling me that our value added is low. Everything about that school was wonderful, but it wasn't showing in that the difference between the input and the output had actually, there wasn't that marginal gain in children's examinations. Now, it's interesting that in Hong Kong, what they've done is to put into the curriculum 15% of curriculum time must be what they call other learning experiences. Now, teachers didn't like this at first, and a lot of teachers still don't, but it's saying 15% of children's school experience should be about cultural exchange, visiting other countries, doing other things than academic work, because our research tells us that we perform very well in Hong Kong, like Singapore and like Shanghai and like Thailand and Finland, of course. But are our children actually coming out of school with the right kind of values? Does our school represent value added in that sense? The definition of insanity. And this is the problem. This is the problem in our country at this very moment with our new government, that they say if you work harder and you do more intense working and you put more pressure on teachers and you put more into the curriculum and you have more tests, then things will get better. And we know that is simply not true. This book from Taleb, The Black Swan, he says, we learn from repetition at the expense of events that have not happened before. So how do you learn not from the past, but with an anticipation of what might happen in the future? I love this quote. I'm going to ask you to see if anybody knows where this quote comes from. In all my years at sea, I've only ever seen one vessel in distress. I had never seen a wreck. I'd never been wrecked. I was never in any predicament. Never seen a disaster. It's very improbable. How could it possibly happen? Do you know who that was? Who said that? Captain Smith, captain of the Titanic. That's the Titanic syndrome. Remember that one. In our book, which you have the chapter from Michael and Wilfred in there, that excellent chapter, one of 62 chapters in that book, we quote, or Bajanid quotes himself, in fact, and he's talking about Malaysia, and he's talking about the rush to modernize, the rush to more assessment, more value added, more calculation. But have we forgotten the huge legacy in Malaysia of what they call the prophetic tradition, the Socratic tradition, in which education was about asking questions, self-knowledge, learning by doing, storytelling. A lot of that in Malaysia has disappeared. We have a Malaysian visiting professor at the moment at Cambridge, and she laments what is happening in her country because she's part of a global movement which is wanting to make the whole system more and more bureaucratic, more and more like other countries who are in that race, the OECD race to the top. In the book, there are chapters from South Africa, from China, from USA, from Southern American countries, from Australia, New Zealand, and indeed Austria. And this is what head teachers in other countries are saying. Maybe it's not what's happening here, but in South Africa, little wriggle room for head teachers. No space to move because we're in the firing line of political pressure. That is South Africa. China, talking about uncomfortable, increasingly uncertain, fraught with tension. Huge pressures at the moment in China. I've just come back in the last few weeks from Shanghai. Some lovely schools, wonderful things, but they want to be there at the top of the league tables as well. And of course, folks, you heard it here first, Shanghai is now top of the league tables ahead of Finland. So you must all go to Shanghai to see what they do. And of course, what they do is not only pressure in school, but they will have 4 or 5 hours. Children will be doing work outside school in tutorial centers and so on to keep that pressure on. In Scotland, a recent research we did, head teachers talked about being frazzled. That's a good Scottish word for you, frazzled. It's very onomatopoeic. It tells you what it means, doesn't it? Oh, I'm feeling frazzled, stressed, burnt out. And in the USA, miserable and frustrated principals. In Austria, this pull, which I'm sure everybody's experienced between the Sollen and the Wollen, the things you have to do, but the things that you really are driven by, the values you're driven by. The 3 worlds of childhood. Children growing up, having to negotiate among those 3 worlds, the academic world with its set of values and its pressures, its expectations, its aspirations, the social world in which they're growing up with other young people, with parents, with a whole range of different people they meet, which often, yes, okay, it's misspelled, the academic world, sorry. And they have to work between those two. Why are you laughing? They have to work between these two worlds. And the third world, the cyber world. Now, how much time do children spend in those worlds, or how much do those worlds actually overlap? This is why when I get data like this from a big meta-study that I see quoted again and again and again, which looks at, it tries to look at individual effects. So, for example, the effect size of the class environment would be 0.56. And homework would have an effect size of 0.46. And parental involvement would have an effect size of 0.50. I've tried to get somebody to explain it to me, and perhaps, Louise, you'll help me afterwards and explain this. But I find it not only very difficult, but very troubling, because underneath all of this, what do we understand by parental involvement? What do we understand by homework? I did research for years into homework. I spent evenings sitting in houses with children, watching them and talking to them about the homework they were doing, talking to parents and so on. And beneath that statistic lies a huge range of questions and problems. And then, of course, at the bottom, television has a 0.12 minus effect. And yet again, doesn't it depend entirely on the kind of television you're watching? So this kind of attempt at using this kind of data we go further and further and further, trying to isolate effects rather than looking at what you might call the ecology of the school and the interrelationships in the school. Michael some time ago gave me a book called Warum muss ich in die Schule gehen? And I should have had it in German, Michael, shouldn't I? But I translated it into English. But the book is a series of letters. Perhaps you've seen the book. Have you used the book in your academy? Which is a series of letters from Uncle Tobias to his nephew. And the nephew saying, Warum muss ich in die Schule gehen? And kind old Uncle Bias gives him a lot of different answers, but I like this one because it's about the children you meet and talk to from other countries, people of different religions, children who are very good at mathematics or not very good at mathematics, children in a wheelchair. And the concluding sentence, school is first and foremost to bring young people together and to help them to learn to live in a way that our political society so badly needs. Would we have all the troubles that we have if schools were better at that as a social milieu? Here's something I'm going to ask you just to take about less than a minute at giving me the answer to this. 10 to 11-year-olds, how many hours in a year do they spend in school? How many hours do they spend at home? And how many hours in the virtual world? And I'll give you an answer from research conducted at the other place. If you're at Cambridge, you refer to the other place, yes. So just 1 minute at your tables, and then we'll see. This is a test. We'll see how well you do. 1 minute. Okay, this may not be the same in Austria or Sweden. This research was done in England, so it may be different here, but hours in school, 8. Sorry? 6 hours. No, over the course of a year. Sorry, I'm not a very good teacher. Over the course of a year, how many hours do children spend in school? Okay, take your 6 and multiply it by whatever. So, how many? 1,500? No, too many. 1,000, too many. 1,000. Getting in the kind of ballpark, 1,000-ish. And what about hours at home? No, hours at home, more than that. And hours in the virtual world, that is online. Email, link, YouTube, etc., etc. What would you say? About the same. Right, well, this is her research, okay? This is Baroness Greenfield's research. So nearly 2,000 hours, this is of course average, this is an aggregate, but so she's saying nearly 2,000 hours for children on the internet in the virtual world. Now the issue this raises, of course, is first of all, what legitimate expectations can you have of schools for the 900 hours? How much do you hold schools, is it verantwortlich, or accountable for the 900 hours? And the hours at home in very different kinds of families, and the hours on the internet or in the virtual world. What are the implications for how teachers are able to make the bridge between what children learn in and out of school? Now, we know for certain that in many countries, most countries, the gap between the high-achieving children and the lowest-achieving children is not closing. It's staying as big as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. This may not be true in Austria, but it's certainly true in New Zealand, Australia, United States, Canada, possibly slightly less so, actually, the UK, and many other countries. So what is it? What are the implications of that for the work of teachers and the work of school leaders in trying to build the bridges between learning in school and learning out of school? No, you weren't downloaded, you were born. Remember that thing, birth? Yeah. And I love this from David Berliner in the United States, who writes about children living nested lives. Some wonderful research, too, by Louis Vacon in Parisian suburbs. Have you seen that film called, it's Entre les murs? Anybody seen that film? Anybody? Good boy. I'll speak to you afterwards. Absolutely fantastic film, filmed in a school in a Paris suburb. If you get a chance to see it. In English, it's called The Class, but it misses the whole point of the film, entre les murs, between the walls. What is being learned between the walls? Because these children come from very, very disadvantaged Parisian suburbs. He won an award. This was an outstanding teacher who won an award for his teaching. But at the end of the film, I'm going to give away the ending now. He's sitting at his desk at the end of the whole school year, and he's exhausted trying to teach these children. And this little girl comes out. Everybody's gone, and the girl comes out and stands in front of his desk and says, "Sir, I've learned nothing." It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. And of course, it's not true. She's learned all sorts of things, but not necessarily the subject that he was trying to teach her. She's learned a lot of things about social relationships. She's learned a lot of things about the nature of learning and teaching, and she's learned a lot of things about the nature of school. But the whole message from David Berliner, we have to look at the relationship between school, family, neighborhood, peer group, who he says shape attitudes and aspirations. Unfortunately, leider, often more powerfully than their parents or their teachers. So if I say to you the 5 W's plus H, they all work in five. In German it's 5, it's 6 W's, isn't it? Was, wo, wann, wie, warum, und. No, wer and then wie, yes, okay, you've got 6 W's. If you were to say, which of these is most important for children thinking about their school experience and what they're going to take away from school when they leave and they enter that world of work and that adult work and that social world, what's going to matter most? Would you take just about another minute or so just to see if there's any agreement on what you think would be an ordering of what matters most? What would you put at the top? It's very hard. Is it too hard for you? Zu schwer. Okay, sorry. I'll ask an easier question next time. This is provocative. You may not agree. It's hard, and of course I am being provocative. But there's a fair amount of research that says who you go to school with is the most important thing. It's called in the jargon would call it the compositional effect. Who you go to school with. Why do parents buy independent schools, in what you'd call in England public schools, for their children? Because it's the other children they go to school with. So the who, the peer effect, is hugely powerful. And of course, the thing that you take away with you from school most powerfully is how to learn, learning how to learn. And of course, I heard some people say the why question. Why? Why are you teaching me this? Why am I learning this? What's the nature of a curriculum? And the where. The where. Where you learn. When you look back on this conference and you try to remember something I said, you may picture this room and you may picture me if you're very unlucky. And you will remember because of the context. Here's a tip if you want to raise attainment of children. Test them in the room where they were learning, not in a big exam room. Because as soon as you take them out, they haven't got the contextual clues to help them. So the where and the when, and I'll not go on about that because I want to talk a little, first of all, about some of those things. The was. Here's another book. It's called The Saber-Tooth Curriculum. Anybody read it? You have. You've read everything, though. You know, you hate the people in the class who are just the smarties, don't you? They know everything. The Saber-Tooth Curriculum is written, it's written by a professor of education, but he calls himself Harold Jacobson, a pen name. But he says it's a story of how thousands of years once saber-toothed tigers had disappeared off the planet, that was still part of the curriculum because you really need to know about saber-toothed tigers. And you need to know about how to kill a saber-toothed tiger. It's very important. But we don't have saber-toothed tigers anymore. Doesn't matter. This is in the curriculum. To learn tiger scaring, it's helpful to have a real tiger. The vo. That was the who. What about the where? John Dewey. The only true education comes through the stimulation of a child's powers by the demands of the situations, the social situations in which he finds himself. That Dewey's whole philosophy, shall I ask who has read John Dewey? The smart boy in the front. Whoops, it's got a mind of its own. Dewey talks about the context, the where, how we learn through where we find ourselves, the social situation in which we find ourselves in the classroom, in the school, outside of school. And the American researcher, Lauren Resnick, talks about 4 things which we really need to understand in order for children to achieve more and learn better within schools. And she says the difference is, in school, it tends to be very individual cognition. Your thinking is inside your own head, whereas outside, we share ideas. It's what you call distributed intelligence. We learn together with other people. And then she says, in school, pure mentation, thinking, pure thinking, abstract thinking, whereas outside school, it's very much about tools and how we work with our tools of learning. In school, it's more about symbols, but outside school, much more about contextualized reasoning, how we learn and think in a particular context, and generalized learning rather than very situation-specific learning, which takes place outside of school. Which means that we need to take account of this much more in how we move between these 2 worlds of the world outside school and the world inside school. This is the Strozzi Museum in Firenze, and its curator, James Bradburn, this wonderful image. Nobody ever failed a museum. And it's become a hugely important hub for scaffolding and structuring children's learning. It's not about just going in and looking at exhibits, but what can you learn in a museum? And he's devoted a lot of his life to restructuring the museum experience so that it's an educational experience. And if you want to have a good keynote next year, get Ken Robinson. He'll only charge you £10,000. It's a bargain. He was chair of the Government Creativity Committee in England. He lives in California. He charges £10,000. But you can go onto the web and you can just put in Ken Robinson and you'll get all his stock, so you don't have to pay £2,000. But he talks about, in school, one of the problems is children are afraid of being wrong. Were you afraid of being wrong when you were at school? I was. If you don't know the answer, you don't put up your hand. Frightened to be wrong because mistakes are a bad thing. And we don't want to make mistakes. It's the worst thing that can happen. One young teacher, you'll remember him, Louise Matthew, who, he brought James Dyson. I don't know if that means anything here, and that he invented that vacuum cleaner, which is very big, certainly in the UK. We've got one. And he invited James Dyson in to talk to his children. And they said, how many times did you try to invent that? How many failures did you have? And he said, I had 120. But they were all learning opportunities. Every failure was a learning opportunity. And Matthew, that teacher of physics, up outside his classroom on the wall were all these little experiments that children had done. I tried this 22 times before I got it right. How do you learn if you don't make mistakes? And that was on his wall. Isn't that great? If at first you fail, try again. Fail better. And what we know about learning, all we know from research into the brain, research into social learning, that all learning has a social component. All our learning is social. Even if we're on our own working, it's still got that internal audience in your head. And all learning has an emotional context. I heard the minister talking about emotions and emotions and emotions. And of course, teaching is hugely emotional activity, as is leadership, as well as intellectual. There is always one moment in childhood when the door opens to let the future in. Wrote Graham Greene. How do we find that moment which lets the future in? Going the wrong direction? So finally, in the last few minutes, to say what the messages are, I think, in this for leadership. A lot of people talk about business and schools, the business of leadership. But here's someone which is in the book. We take them big, small, rich, poor, gifted, exceptional, abused, frightened, confident, homeless, rude, brilliant. We take them with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, all sorts of illnesses. We take them, everyone. And that's why it's not a business, it's a school. And I think that speaks very powerfully to people who would want schools to run on the lines of business. Now, this is not Austria, because you have a very flat hierarchy, I know. So beware. If you want to go into more hierarchical organization, think about this, that the more hierarchical you are, it's not very pleasant to be down at the bottom. I'm going to move on a bit. When we did the Carpe Vitam study that Michael referred to, and we had Austrian schools involved in that, they had a great deal of trouble with this notion of agency. What does it mean to be agential, to be in control of your own learning, to be in control of your own lives? And in that project, we talked about learning is an activity, isn't it? But leadership is an activity. And when I walked up the road here, there's a little plaque that says Führungspersonen im Bildungswesen. Is that right? Führungspersonen im Bildungswesen. That's it. Führungspersonen. Who are they? They're not just people in this room, but they are the people who are, as Joe Murphy says, right at the center of the web of human relationships. Not up there at the pinnacle, but in the web, the center of the web of human relationships. That's what distributed leadership, which the minister referred to, that's what it is about. And the OECD, how do we create a knowledge-rich profession in which teachers have the authority to act and the necessary knowledge to do so, and access to effective support? The global challenge. And Phil Hallinger, who's now in Hong Kong, talks about transformational leadership, which is about increasing the capacity of others. And he's talking mainly about teachers here, but it could be teachers and young people, increasing the capacity of other people to exercise leadership, creating that environment so all of those complaining, unhappy teachers, is it because they're in an environment in which they haven't got the authority or the empowerment to make a difference? I don't know what the answer is in your context, but very often it's because teachers feel disempowered and without that authority. In the book, one of the chapters by the Canadians, Larry Sackney and Coral Mitchell, in successful schools, learning leaders who are open to learning, they know the people, they know the organization, the community, the context. They ask questions. They know what's happening within pedagogy, teaching and learning. And most importantly, they find ways to release the creative energy of teachers. Those teachers, those complaining teachers, underneath there is some creative energy, believe it or not, which needs to be released. So how do you create the environment which releases that energy and builds the capacity? Because teachers do enjoy, actually, intellectual engagement. They do like big ideas, but they struggle sometimes to find out how those big ideas help them in their own schools and in their own classrooms. Just a few things, 2 minutes, and I will finish. I'm not going to take any of your time, Louise, you'll be pleased to know. Some of the ways in which we know from the research from Carpe Vitam, research that we did and others, that seeing one another's work, lesson study, as in Japan, looking at a lesson and being able to analyze what's happening, teaching together, which I know you do, mentoring, coaching, critical friendship, I know is part of the Leadership Academy, learning from and with students, collaborating to plan a lesson together, and sharing and discussing students' work. So finally, I think, flying below the radar, what David Hargreaves talks about is the wonderful things you discover among leaders who have bucked the trend. They're doing something different. They're not intimidated because they've got imagination and creativity, and they follow their best professional instincts. They don't say, oh, I'd love to do that, but I can't afford to because. They just go on innovating and doing exciting things and running very good schools, exciting places for children to be. And this is finally my Spanish. Caminante, no hay camino, se hace camino para andar. Traveler, there is no path. You make the path by walking. And I think, was it Michael, you gave me a German translation for that? Es gibt zwar ein Ziel, aber keinen Weg zum Ziel. You make the path by walking. Vielen Dank.